The importance of understanding what happened at Cross Plains has to do with our concept of humanity. How we think about people who have different ideas than we have, who practice a different religion, who bring different ideas, social ideas, into our communities and try to practice them. That's the value of Cross Plains.
It was one of those things that happened, best forgotten, and I think the people of the community, once they got over the shock of this, wanted to go on as though it never happened. I'm just trying to understand this from a very personal perspective, because if I had been there, I might have, in my heart, resisted any notion of anyone else, foreigner, Yankee, scalawag, carpetbagger. I don't want my life changed. I want it the way I want it.
The Civil War was over, but there was no peace. Reconstruction, the North's attempt to remake Southern society, was a hopeful time for Southern blacks, who now gained their long-anticipated freedom. But for many Southern whites, it was a time of frustration and incredible bitterness. They had lost the war and were now being coerced to accept ideas which threatened their traditional way of life. One of the fundamental rights granted the freed slaves was one of the most threatening to many whites: access to education. In the country village of Talladega, Alabama, blacks and northern whites opened one of the first colleges for freed slaves. William Savory, a former slave himself, helped raise funds and organize the college. Savory and the other founders welcomed Reverend Henry Brown, fresh from Ohio, as the first president. Among the new staff Brown recruited was a Canadian, a teacher and minister, William Luke. During his single year in Alabama, Luke would be assailed as a fanatic, a liar, and worse. Yet friends tell me his courage and strength of character were remarkable, to the point of calling him a martyr. The first and last time I met William Luke was in Cross Plains the night of July 11th, 1870.
So you want to know how I ended up in Alabama and in this fix? Well, it's quite a story. You see, in the years prior to the Civil War, Negroes had fled to Canada through what was then known as the Underground Railroad. Over 20,000 slaves found a safe haven just a few miles from my home in the Ontario province. They told amazing stories of their hardships and how they'd escaped. Most arrived with practically nothing. Anyway, after the war, I got wind of the plight of the Southern freedmen, and I talked it over with Fanny. That's my wife. We have 6 children. She writes that our youngest is just now beginning to walk. You see, we wanted to minister where we could do the most good. So with my family's blessings, I set south, with the full intention of having them join me here just as soon as I'd settled in. Oh, it was all so very exciting.
Yes, yes. I remember it like it was yesterday. There I was in Cincinnati recruiting teachers for my new college in Talladega. I was in the offices of the American Missionary Association when in walks William. There was something about him. You know, we were looking for a staff that were fired with a missionary zeal and with a deep concern for these newly freed people of the South. Will Luke, Irish-born, Canadian-bred, and full of motivation, he fit the bill perfectly.
This incredible man, William Savory, and I hit it off right away and became fast friends. I say incredible because of all the things he's gone through. When William was a slave in the 1850s, he helped to build a school for the white children of the well-to-do Talladega Baptist. Well, he laughs now, saying he would have built it even better had he known his children would have ended up going to school there. After the war, Most folks were in financial trouble. Savory and his friends found out the owners were selling the Baptist school building and some 34 acres. They persuaded General Swain of the Freedmen's Bureau to pitch the idea of a Negro institution in Talladega to the American Missionary Association. It worked. Despite all the odds, the college opened its doors in 1867 to train and educate teachers who could build Negro schools across the South. Talladega College was truly an amazing place. You see, for over 100 miles in any direction, this was the only school for Negroes of any age. Most of these men and women were former slaves who had been made ignorant by law. To teach them had been a crime.
Sometimes it was like I was dreaming. I would rub my eyes and try to wake myself. When my boys and girls started coming home with their algebras, Greek and Latin books, I says to myself, are these my children that were slaves a few years ago, counted no more than cattle? It is not a dream now. It's the blessed truth.
I tell you, this is a social revolution, and I am smack in the middle of it. I mean, here it is. It's 1870. The Civil War is over. Slavery is dead, and for the first time in our history, Negroes are voting and actually holding office. I tell you, it is the end of the old order in the South.
I enjoyed Mr. Luke's company, but I was always needling him about being such an innocent. Like the old song goes, a wayfaring stranger. I mean, he be trying to learn the ways of the South, and that ain't easy. One day after making a delivery in town, he came to me and said he heard some men referring to him as an NT. Now, he had no idea what an NT was. I think he was embarrassed when I told him it meant nigger teacher.
When it came to educating the Negro, public opinion did not change with the laws. No one wants to be on the bottom rail of society. And so these poor, uneducated whites are struggling for the respect they feel they deserve as white men. These men are convinced of the impossibility of blacks and whites coexisting without complete white control and complete black submission. So it wasn't long before our teachers were shut out from the Talladega community. Our lovely college on the hill was an island unto itself. We couldn't even get local food for our students and staff. We had to ship it in from our friends from around the country. But that wasn't the worst of it. The Klan had come to town.
For some reason, the founders of this strange organization called themselves the Ku Klux Klan. One original member said it made him think of bones rattling together. Founded in Pulaski, Tennessee by a few Confederates, the Klan galloped across the countryside like the ghosts of the Confederacy, wearing outlandish disguises to terrorize Negro folk and whites, especially Republicans who got out of line. The famed Nathan Bedford Forrest became the Grand Wizard, and with Forrest behind the Klan, it spread like wildfire with the ultimate goal of restoring white supremacy and serving the Democratic Party. Despite the killings and beatings, in 1870, prominent politicians, such as Alabama's governor, denied the very existence of the Ku Klux Klan. The evidence, of course, was overwhelming to the contrary.
One night, the Klan decided to storm Talladega College. Our school was quite a sitting target. Local Negroes, Savory and others, threatened to burn the town down if the school was invaded. Finally, town leaders helped talk the Klan out of the raid.
I'm not a big fan of these Kluxers, but you have to understand the resentment to change. Uneducated Negroes and ill-bred Northerners have taken over the State House. Corruption is incredible. The Klan's growth is just a reflection of the contempt we have for this so-called moral crusade by the North, this Reconstruction of the South.
At the college, we tried to ignore the Klan and get on with our lives. Our challenge was already daunting. You know, these students, young and old, had been stripped of any sense of self-worth. Trying to instill self-esteem, build character, well, it's just as important as learning math and spelling. But there was such a climate of mistrust, of violence. So when the railroad came calling, I listened. Yes, I really listened. Perhaps they could help us survive.
Just north of Talladega, Calhoun County, Alabama included a scattering of tiny villages and quiet farms along the foothills of the Appalachians. But at the intersection of two main roads, Cross Plains had built a tough reputation as a town with many more saloons than churches. In 1870, townspeople were excited about a plan by the Selma, Rome, and Dalton Railroad. The state's largest railroad was going to locate its headquarters nearby and build a model community they called Peytona. New York investors, led by the prominent Astor family, hired large crews of workers to complete the line to Georgia, where it would intersect with rails extending all the way to New York City. They were building giant machine shops, a main depot, and hotels. There was a commitment of millions.
I thought the Peytona and Cross Plains area would be a great community, a metropolis someday. And so I met with Captain Barney of the Selma-Dalton line. He laid out quite a plan. You see, he wanted to start a school for Negroes in Peytona that would prepare them for Talladega College. And upon graduating from Talladega College, they would be guaranteed a job with the railroad. Well, he met with Luke, and then we both agreed that he was the perfect choice to work in Peytona and help develop the first freedman school.
I was thrilled to work for the railroad. It meant starting a school from scratch, and I could even hold prayer meetings. Oh, I got to work right away. I rented a room at the new Peytona Hotel, but a few days later, a couple of the locals told the owner that I was a nigger teacher for the railroad, and he kicked me out.
I went to the rail depot to visit Will, and some men there told me that nobody by that name worked for the railroad. So I continued to ask around and was finally directed to the home of a Negro family where Will was staying. Frankly, I was beginning to be concerned, but he insisted that everything was going to be all right. I told Will, we'll keep you in our prayers.
My opinion of William Luke, he was known to be one of the most rabid Negro equality fanatics that ever came into this county. He was repeatedly advised by friends and warned by enemies to desist from his teaching and get out of the county. He should have heeded that advice.
In that summer of 1870, things were running out of control all across the South. Racial and political passions were running strong and deep. In Cross Plains, a minor scuffle set everything off. It started at the depot as everyone gathered to meet the Sunday evening train.
Former slave Green Little was sitting on the depot steps when Pat Craig rode up and asked Little to take care of his mule while he met with friends on the loading platform. The whistle from the 6 o'clock train excited the mule. It jerked at the reins held by Little and bolted down the road. Craig cursed Little, tackled him roughly, and the fight was on. A couple of Craig's friends joined in, and soon Green Little was being hit and kicked. Finally, the station agent came out with a shotgun, scattering everyone.
Green Little came back to the Negro section of Peytona where I lived and recruited 4 or 5 armed men to go back to Cross Plains with him. I tried to calm them down. All the town needed was an attack by armed Negroes to bring the Klan in from all directions, but they would not listen to me.
Pat Craig and some friends had got wind of the Negroes arming themselves and gathered up their shotguns and pistols. It was now near dusk, and part of the Methodist congregation was headed home from services. It so happened, Little's group spotted Craig on the other side of the crossroads, with many of the Methodist congregation in the middle. Little fired a shot over the church members' heads, Then Craig's boy set out chasing the Negroes, shooting and wounding one of them badly.
Now, from what I hear, the incident with the church folk was exaggerated tremendously. The Negroes fired a single warning shot, that's all. The lives of church folk were never in danger. Still, white townspeople claimed that Negroes attacked innocent citizens and might even set fire to the town. They were in a frenzy.
All night, posses of whites herded Negroes into town. Many were dragged from their homes and beaten. They failed to find Green Little, but among the men brought in was the stranger from Canada, the teacher of the Freedman School, William Luke.
They held an inquiry today, right after they had arrested most of the Negro population and myself. I testified about my lack of involvement in the incident and was backed up by the word of the Negroes. But that wasn't all of it. They started asking if I thought a Negro woman was equal to a white woman in the sight of God, whether the Negro should seek the same wages as whites doing the same job, and so on. I couldn't lie and say that I didn't teach my students these fundamental truths. When they had finished with me, well, I tried to help the Negroes cope with the questioning. You see, they were intimidated by the crowd and they needed someone to stand up for them. But before the inquiry could finish, well, they adjourned for the night and brought us here to this jail under the guard of a deputy sheriff.
They should never have had that inquiry in Cross Plains or held those men in town. Word spread that some sort of Negro uprising had been put down. Klansmen from well outside Calhoun County soon descended on Cross Plains.
A raging signal fire was lit about 9 o'clock on Chimney Peak, a good 11 miles from Cross Plains, but everyone could see it. Most knew what it meant. Armed Klansmen broke into the rail office at Peytona, forcing the night clerk to wire the northbound train to stop at Blue Mountain until further notice. The Klan wanted no interference.
I'm making such a difference in the lives of the Negro people here. In a real way, the South has rekindled my spirit. When this blows over, I'm going to send for Fanny and the children.
Later, farmers heard groups of horses galloping through the night. If they had been able to see the riders, it would have been quite a sight, because the Klan was in full costume. They came together at their usual meeting place, a Baptist church near Cross Plains, and gathered their courage.
It's so quiet. Even the cicadas are silent. Usually I've heard the train whistle by now. It's so comforting, somehow.
It was the noon hour when we arrived at Cross Plains Station. With me was a good friend, Judge Charles Pellin. Just a mile north of the town center, we came upon the area we had been told about. The trampled ground led us through the brush, and there it was. 2 had been shot to death. Luke and the others still had the ropes around their neck. We heard stories later that Luke had been dragged from jail, claiming innocence, then prayed out loud while the Negroes were killed. Then something unusual. His murderers granted him a final request to write a note. We looked about and we found it wedged under a splinter.
My dear wife, I die tonight. It had been so determined by those who think I deserve it. God only knows I feel myself entirely innocent of the charge. I have only sought to educate the Negro. I little thought when leaving you that we should thus part forever so far distant from each other, but God's will be done. He will be to you a husband better than I have been, and a father to our 6 little ones. God of mercy bless and keep you ever, dear, dear wife and children. Your William.
My friend William Luke was dead, but so was many others. Later that night, another man, Essex Hendricks, was found hung from a tree. And what about Green Little, whose fight with Pat Craig had started it all? He was found by the Klan across the Georgia state line and lynched. And you know, as incredible as it may sound, if it wasn't for the one white man of the bunch, the lynchings probably would have been quickly covered, ignored, and forgotten.
7 men dead in a matter of hours. The publicity was incredible. Reporters from the North were all over the place. Hundreds of troops came to Cross Plains and Peytona. An Associate Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court held a court of inquiry, and a former governor was the prosecuting attorney.
Our citizens had no hand in the killing of those Negroes charged with murderously assaulting women and children as they returned from worship services. The men who perpetrated the deed were thoroughly concealed behind grotesque disguises, and no man knows from where they came nor where they went. Calhoun County is innocent.
They investigated for 2 months, questioned 140 witnesses, and 9 men were arrested for taking part in the lynching. But the Calhoun County grand jury soon released them because no one had the guts to charge them. It was over.
If you look at him through the lens of today, Luke had to be a hero. Because here was a man who was utterly dedicated to what he believed was right, and he was willing to stake his life for this.
William Luke was a man that you either admired or you absolutely hated. He was driven by real religious passion, deep religious passions. But at the same time, he brought with him ideas that were dangerous to the average white Southerner.
To me, that Southern mentality, this rural Calhoun County mentality, was a fierce, bold, reactive resistance to change.
The nationwide attention given the Cross Plains lynchings and other violence across the South led Congress to pass a sweeping measure, the Ku Klux Act of 1871. This, for the first time, designated certain crimes committed by individuals as punishable under federal law. Hundreds of Klansmen were indicted. The Reconstruction career of the Ku Klux Klan was over. Still, by 1877, it was clear Reconstruction had failed. National economic issues took precedence over humanitarian efforts, and a new regime took hold in the South. Home rule was restored, and soon brought with it a rigidly segregated society. The lynchings left an indelible stain on the communities of Cross Plains and Peytona. The railroad run by the Astor family ceased construction of its headquarters and deserted Peytona, shifting its resources to Selma and then to the newly established iron-rich community of Birmingham, Alabama.
Honestly, had the Astor plan been carried through, I'm not sure the population centers in Alabama or even Georgia would be the same as they are today. I would imagine the Gadsden, Anniston, Piedmont area would be the metropolis area of the South.
In 1888, the Cross Plains newspaper led a movement to help wipe clean the reputation of the town and attract industry. That's when Cross Plains changed its name to Piedmont, Alabama. The community of Peytona no longer exists. Four of William Savory's children received teaching degrees from the college he helped build as a slave. Henry Brown left Talladega College a short time after the lynchings, but returned to build a theology department. The 6 black men lynched the night of July 11, 1870, were buried in unmarked graves somewhere in Calhoun County. Services were held for William Luke at Talladega College. He is buried in Talladega's Oak Hill Cemetery.
I am a poor wayfaring stranger while traveling through this world below. There is no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright world to which I go.